So we're going to look at a little bit of Nehemiah, which kind of fits in with Easter. One of the dilemmas and things that concerns me in life is that those of you who don't know me very well only see what I'm like on the platform, and you may have the impression that I start every morning with a song in my heart and a gleam in my eye and peace in my soul. And then what happens is you either talk to me at 8:30 or you just come into the church during the week and you discover that not only am I bad-tempered in the morning, but I'm fairly grumpy all day, and that joy isn't really one of my gifts. What is joy? This is something that has troubled me most of my Christian life, because we know that joy is a fruit of the Spirit. It is a part of what God creates in us. And yet, I always analyzing myself and thinking, am I really joyful? And most of the time I conclude I'm not very joyful. And part of that is a struggle with trying to understand what is joy and how what are we meant to do when things are difficult, when there are strains. And a lot of what I do, as is a lot of what you do, is hard. You're dealing with difficult situations. You're dealing with sadness. You're dealing with problems. You're dealing with difficulty. How is one meant to have joy? And what on earth is joy? We hear, rejoice in the Lord and smile and be happy, and I just feel worse. And if I meet cheerful people, I'm not always gracious with them. So what does it mean? This comes into Nehemiah because there is a verse which, when I was reading about it, and I thought, oh, that's going to come up on Easter Sunday. We could do that on Easter Sunday. Do not grieve, Nehemiah says, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. And I thought, oh, that's going to be great. I will do that on Easter Sunday. And I was very enthusiastic, and I drafted it out. Then when I came to it this week, I thought, it just doesn't work. I don't understand this. So I started it all again. And then I got to Friday and I thought, well, I'd start it all again. It doesn't really work. And I started it all again. So the whole thing has not been a very joyful experience. Trying to work out, what is joy? What does it mean? And 3 questions I want to try and ask. How can joy help us? And to ask how can joy help us, we've got to answer this question. How can we have joy in the midst of troubles? Which makes us then really ask the fundamental root question, what is the joy of the Lord? What is joy when things are going wrong? What is it about? What does it look like? The context, for those of you that are new to us, haven't been following us, all of this is on our YouTube channel, all of this is on our podcast, but Nehemiah has finished and completed the wall. And last week we looked at how Ezra, they gathered together with this newly completed secure city, and they began to read the Old Testament law. And we looked last week at how the Old Testament law might or might not apply to us today, and all of those difficult and peculiar bits and some of the fundamental bits. And we recognize that it's all summed up with the command to love, to care, to look after, to do good to our fellow man. That is how we sum up the whole law. So if you want to go back and explore that, you can. But they've come together on what they're calling this holy day. What do they mean? Well, it was a significant day. They were coming together and they were dedicating that day to God. And then we read that this strange thing happens, because they all start to cry and to weep and to mourn. And Nehemiah or Ezra says, do not mourn or weep. For the people have been weeping as they listened to the words of the Lord. So why were they upset? Why were they weeping? Some people might think that it was tears of joy. They were really grateful to be back in the city and to be able to read Scripture again together in a safe place. But that doesn't really explain why they were told not to mourn. Actually, there was something that was deeply sad in their minds. So it probably wasn't tears of joy. It could have been sadness at what they had lost, because not only had they not done this before, but their parents and their grandparents hadn't done this before. Then a sense of all that they had missed out on. But as one reads it, one gets the impression that they realized that they hadn't kept God's commands, and that they felt an overwhelming sense of guilt and shame. And the more I thought about it this week, the more important it has been to me to identify that within all of us, that we carry this epidemic in our culture, what we call low self-esteem. If I said, stand up if you like yourself, none of us would do it. We all carry, to different degrees, a sense of insecurity, a sense of guilt, a sense of shame, a sense of failure, and a sense of regret. And when they came and were hearing Scripture, it feels like it became overwhelming. They felt rubbish. They felt that they needed to almost punish themselves. They felt unworthy to be there. They felt useless, and they wept and they grieved. They felt that everything was lost because they had failed so badly. But they were told to come in to God's presence, not in that manner, but to come with celebration. This wasn't to be a day of guilt and shame. And religion, and we've been a part of it as religious people, Christianity, we so easily inflict shame on people and guilt. And they are told to celebrate. Go and enjoy choice food and sweet drinks. And to share it. One of the things that we are tremendously privileged to have is a food bank, which is escalating in ministry and reach over the last few years. Every year doubled and doubled and doubled. And it is a real privilege to be able to share food with people. It's one of the biggest things that we do through the week. And that's part of what they were told to do. They could have said back and said, well, we've got food, and those who've made poor choices and got things wrong haven't got their own food. But they're told to celebrate by sharing that food with those who are in need. And then it's emphasized, do not grieve, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. And that's the context for this verse, which we want to explore. And we want to explore these three questions. How can joy help us? How can we have joy in the midst of troubles? And what is the joy of the Lord? So we're going to start at the bottom and work backwards, because in order to know how joy can help us, we need to understand what joy is. What is the joy of the Lord? Let's be clear. It is not the absence of difficulty. It is not that we kind of have some incredible faith that means that nothing goes wrong for us and we're always well and we're always rich and we're always in good relationships and everything goes well. That is a fantasy that Scripture bears no relation to. And this passage bears no relation to, because if that were true, the joy wouldn't be the strength, because we wouldn't need strength because everything is going perfectly. And we, in our 8:30 calls to prayer, which go online live, and then you can pray through them through the week and break them up into 5-10 minute slots. We use different psalms, and through the psalms we see again and again the psalmist cry out to God, where are you? What are you doing? And we discover Jesus quoting on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's not really about whether that's literally true. It's about that is literally how he felt. He felt in anguish. And so joy is not the denial of the reality of difficulty. Every one of us has or is, or I don't want to disappoint you, will go through struggle. We will find relationships that don't work, that break and hurt. We will have stresses and pressure and things that we feel are building up on us. We will have illness, and we will lose loved ones. And if joy is somehow to shut that out and to pretend that it isn't there and that actually everything's great and to put a smile and come into church and go, hey, I am happy because even though there is war in the Middle East, and even though there is war in Ukraine, and even though the cost of living is affecting me, and even though I am grieving, and even though my job is under pressure, and even though I'm struggling with this relationship, I'm pretending that everything's happy. That isn't joy. We know that because that isn't how Jesus lived. And as we think this Easter, we recall Thursday night. Jesus goes to pray, knowing he's about to be betrayed, he is about to be humiliated, he is about to have a crown of thorns put upon his head, he's about to be whipped, he is about to die agonizingly over hours in tremendous pain, and he's in anguish. He says, look, if there's any way this doesn't need to happen to me, could it happen? But we read in Hebrews a key to understanding joy. The writer says, let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him, the joy that was to come, he endured the cross, scorning its shame. Jesus did not find the cross fun, but because he knew something greater was coming after and was going to be achieved by it. He saw a joy that he looked for, and that gave him strength. So the joy of the Lord is my strength. In part is to say that which is to come, when every tear is wiped away, when there is no more death or sorrow, when creation stops groaning in expectation and pain because the Messiah has come, that is when we are free. So part of joy is holding life, if you like, bifocally. I'm wearing bifocals. What does bifocals? Bifocals mean that you see things in different perspective. And there's an eye on the distance, and there's an eye on what's close. Paul in Corinthians says we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary. What is unseen is eternal. Part of joy is that we know it's going to end. And we know something better is to come. Now, I was telling the morning congregation that over the last few months, I foolishly thought it would be a good thing to set myself the target of doing what's called the plank, which is an exercise every day. Now, the plank, for some of you are incredibly fit, you probably do it for hours and hours every day. The plank, and they dared me this morning to show you, and I bet they all knew what it was, but they just made me do it. But the plank is kind of like a press-up, but you hold it, and I'll show you. You go completely straight. Sorry about my microphone. You go completely straight like that. And the idea is, well, I've started at 30 seconds. And I need to tell you that the last, and I've got to 40 seconds. And the last, if you think this is easy, after the service, over tea and coffee, have a go. because what happens is that the last few seconds feel like eternity. And every part of your whole body, I don't even see, but I'm shaking. It is incredibly hard. I've managed to get to 40 seconds. 40 seconds normally is a very short length of time. I haven't been flipping timing. How long has it been? But it feels like a really, really long time. That probably wasn't 40 seconds. The point is this, that when we're in difficulty, time slows down. And we are consumed with the way we are feeling. But difficulty ends. And for the joy set before me, with the belief that it is good for me to do the plank every day, that it is building my heart and my body, my muscles and whatever. And I was told, don't convince me of anything different because I'm working on it now. Just sorry about that. I was told that it is the most effective use of 40 seconds. Who knows? But for the joy set before me, for what I hope it is helping me do, offset the chocolate, we do it. And what is difficult in this life? The fellowship. I've said this so many times. One of the amazing things that Paul says is that all he wants is to know Jesus. And you go, yes, that's all I want. And then he says the most scary thing, and all I want is to know Jesus and him crucified and to share in his sufferings. Jesus tells us to take up a cross, to follow him. He didn't tell us everything's going to be easy. He tells us explicitly that it's hard. But for the joy set before us, for what it will lead to, the hope of glory. So joy is in part the recognition of wonderful things to come. And those wonderful things to come are proven in part by the things that have been. Jesus has risen from the dead. He has died on the cross. We look back and see what he's done, and that tells us what he's going to do. And then also, in part, joy is half an eye on what is to come. It's half an eye on what is being, because what is being gives us the hope for what is to come. And then there are little signs, as John calls them, little tastes, little glimpses, little moments where the curtain is pulled back and we see the good things that are. So the Levites reinforce it. There's repetition in the Bible. Repetition means pay attention. The Levites are saying the same thing. Do not grieve. Don't be overwhelmed by your sense of failure and sin and darkness, but be still. Step back from the busyness of the noise over the next 10, 15 minutes as we move into communion. Step back and reflect and celebrate with great joy. Sending portions of food to others, they celebrated and they understood what they were celebrating. 3 things of their joy, 3 sources of their joy. The first thing is that they are given good things to enjoy. He says, go and enjoy choice food and sweet drinks. Go and celebrate. And one of the things that is sometimes difficult for people like me is we always feel guilty. And we particularly feel guilty when we want to do something pleasurable, relaxing. In some sense, we feel we ought to be more frugal. And it's remarkable that God says, I want you to celebrate what I've made. I want you to eat well. That's why I do the plank, because I eat well. I want you to enjoy good things. And there is a balance in life of experiencing and recognizing the blessings that God has given, at the same time as enduring the brokenness and damage of this world. So it's important for us to recognize and to enjoy without guilt. It may be that he's given us food, and it may be that we don't have enough food. It's maybe that he's given us friendships. It may be that he's given us hobbies or interests or passions, and we feel guilty when we do them. And God says, I want you to enjoy Sabbath. I want you to enjoy rest and relaxation. I am anticipating tomorrow, probably, hopefully, going to watch Cambridge United. I will travel for 2 hours. I will spend £20 on a ticket. I will watch us lose. And I could feel guilty. But for me, that is something that God has given that helps me switch off. And there are times when I need to say, I've done all I can do. I need to step back and enjoy something. You think, well, why would you enjoy football? And I ask the same question. And we focus on what we have, not on what we haven't. And that's a key part of joy. He says, go and have a good meal together. And do it with people who have less. Bring them into the celebration. Share the food. Don't focus on what you haven't got. But we focus on what we have. We call it gratitude. We've learned over the last few years, it's become a key theme for us as a church, hasn't it? To live with gratitude. And I want to show you a cartoon from one of the cartoonists. If you're visiting, you'll discover I like a lot of cartoons. I love cartoons. This is a guy called Michael Lunick. I wouldn't recommend all his cartoons. He's an interesting character, but his spiritual faith has grown over the years, and I love some of his more recent cartoons. And let me share this one with you. It is called a herbal remedy for life ache. And I love that phrase, life ache. It says, you suffer from life ache. And maybe you'd say, yeah, I do. I suffer from life ache. And I feel guilty because I'm supposed to be joyful. And I'm supposed to smile and tell everybody that it's great. But I suffer from life ache. He says, your whole life is sore. And it hurts when you move it. The Bible calls that a wilderness. And God takes us into wilderness times. And we all experience it where everything seems to hurt. And here's the herbal remedy. Take 1 patch of green grass, a mild day, and 2 large green trees. Lie on the grass beneath one tree and contemplate the other tree, all that God has made, the goodness, his creation. Nap from time to time or gaze occasionally at the grass. Let's be still and know that I am God. Same place where I was reading about the benefits of the plank, it was telling me that just breathing in green, the stuff that green plants give out, that God has created it in a way that it restores us. The sun restores us. We need the vitamin D. And then he says this, pain will subside. Life ache cannot be cured, but you can learn to manage the symptoms. The outside may not be your thing to enjoy. It may be music, it may be coffee, it may be friendships, it may be parties, it may be people, it may be football. But find things to enjoy and don't feel guilty about them. Another cartoon for you. Guy says to Jesus, why don't you ever do anything for me? And one of the dangers of life is we think that if I'm a Christian, my life should be easy. Why haven't you done anything for me, Jesus? But of course, he has died in our place. And we're going to come and remember and remind ourselves of that in a few moments. And it leads us into this idea of remembrance, of working out what God has already done. Because one of the reasons they were going to celebrate is that they were going to, as they were reading the scripture, they looked at the calendar and realized that this was the day that they should have been doing a festival called the Festival of Tabernacles. Tabernacles means tent, shelters. It was a festival that they were to celebrate. And they look, it's a bit like realizing not having the Bible for a number of... Oh, sorry about this. Pardon me. I think it is tight. It's a bit like, I know it's hard for you to imagine. Imagine that you had not read the Bible for 30, 40, 50, 60 years, and suddenly you read it, and I know it doesn't say celebrating Christmas in the Bible, because it just doesn't say it. I don't know why we do it, but it's not there. But anyway, imagine that it was. Imagine you're reading the Bible on 25th of December, and you go, oh, this is the day. We should have been doing this. This is what happens. They realized there should have been this festival that comes from Leviticus, when they were to celebrate and they were to live in shelters, in tents for a few days, to remind themselves of the time that when God took them out of Egypt and they went into the desert, that God provided a shelter. The Ark of the Covenant was in this great tent called the tabernacle, the tent of God's presence, and it moved. It followed a cloud that went ahead of them, and they were led and guided through the wilderness. And God was with them, and he gave them manna to eat, and they were provided for. And as they did this, they still doubted God. Even though he'd parted the Red Sea, even though he'd set them free from the Egyptians, they still doubted God, and they didn't think he would be with them as they went into the promised land. And so they ended up wandering in foolishness and disobedience for 40 years. And the Feast of the Tabernacles, the Festival of the Tabernacles, was to remind them. They were reminded they would live in a tent for a week or so, and it would remind them that God had rescued them. It would remind them that God had provided for them. It would remind them that God had guided them. It would remind them that they had failed. But it would remind them that they'd been forgiven, because here they were, still God's people, even though they had failed. And all of this was to create a sense of gratitude, because it was a celebration with lovely, beautiful food. And this second source of joy is not just the things that God says enjoy now, but it's remembrance of what God has done. The prayers he's already answered, the strength he has provided, or the lessons we have learned. Because we remember, and as we look back, we look forward, and we see the mercy and love of God, that Jesus has died on the cross for us. And so Nehemiah says to them, do not grieve, because God isn't waiting to tell you off. God isn't waiting to punish you. God isn't waiting to hurt you. Indeed, Ezra tells us that God is a gracious and merciful God. In the next chapter, which we'll look at next time we do this, he says, in your great mercy, you did not put an end to these people who wandered, or these people who had abandoned God, but they experienced the mercy and the love of God. And there is no need for us to grieve or feel inadequate or in some way to punish ourselves. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn it. And I know there's plenty of religious people that you will find on the internet who will pour out condemnation. But Jesus didn't come to condemn. He came to save. And that's why Nehemiah says the joy of salvation is your strength. It is the thing that is going to get you through these difficult times, because you do the voice that says you're no good, the voice that says you're unworthy, that voice isn't God's. And the joy of the Lord, the joy of forgiveness, of mercy, of grace, that will give you strength. And so hope is alive. So how do we have joy in the midst of trouble? We Find the good things. There are always difficult things, but we look for the good things, the lovely meals, the things that are unexpectedly good. Nature, music, people, hobbies, interests. You remember that last year, a number of us were reading Praying Like Monks, Living Like Fools by Tyler Staton. And if you read that book, you may remember he talks about this Thanksgiving prayer called, I don't know how you pronounce this, Dayenu, something like that, which is part of the Jewish Passover, which is, of course, this weekend and was part of Thursday night. And he describes in the book that Dayenu can be put this way. It can be described as saying it would have been enough. And he talks about looking at life and seeing something and saying, God has done even more than I expected. It would have been enough to have this. And I want to encourage you to have a go at this tonight, maybe, as you go home. Here's an example. So he talks about saying grace. And he says, you could say, God, lunch today would have been enough. Just to have been able to eat lunch this afternoon would have been enough. But he says, but you provided me with the resources to be able to choose what food I could eat. And that will be our experience for most of us. We decided what we were going to eat because there isn't just one thing in our cupboard. And he says, it would have been enough to have eaten, but you gave me options and choices. And then he says, it would have been enough to have had options and choices, but I have live in a world of flavor and spice and culture, which means that food is more than fuel, it is delicious. And maybe that's what you can say about your lunch today. It would have been good enough to have lunch, but you have the choice of what you're eating. It would have been good enough to have the choice, but you have the choice to eat something that was actually nice and good. And then he says, God, a delicious lunch of my own choice would have been enough, but you gave me a friend, a family member to share conversation with over that food. Thank you, God, for overdoing it. That's gratitude. Learning to say, and it doesn't mean that everything's right. There is still grief, there is still brokenness, there is still stress, there is still overwork, there is still financial difficulties, but you find something and you go, do you know that was good? Do you know, I'm grateful that I can go and watch Cambridge United. It would have been enough to go and watch Cambridge United, but we won on Friday against all odds. It would have been enough, but we won last time out. So there's always good things to find. How do we deal with joy in the midst of trouble? We don't pretend the bad things have gone away. We don't deny they're bad, but alongside them, we give thanks in gratitude for the good things. And then we have hope for after the troubles, because we believe Jesus has risen from the dead and there will be no more sorrow, no more suffering. Every tear will be wiped away. And this may feel like a plank. It may feel like the longest 30 seconds or 40 seconds. And we may feel like we're going to die, but it will end. And we will rise with Jesus because he is alive. And then there is no blame when there are no excuses. When we come to God in confession and say, Lord, I've messed up. I am a failure. I haven't listened to your word. I haven't done what you asked. I haven't followed in obedience. Then he says, thank you for your confession. Let's take it away. Let's leave it at the cross. Let's be washed. Let's be cleansed. Let's be forgiven. Let's have new life. There's no blame when there's no excuses. If we try and make excuses and we never confess and we never own up, we just carry the overcoat of guilt. But when we say, Lord, I'm sorry, and we give it to him. And that's why Nehemiah talks about them living in confession and worship at the same time. And we're going to do that in a moment or two. We're going to share in the bread and the cup together. We want to invite you to do that with us, whether that's your normal Christian expectation or whether that's something that you felt you weren't good enough to do. Or maybe others said you weren't good enough to do. And maybe others put an expectation. You've got to do this, you've got to do this, you've got to do this. And we want to invite you, as Jesus invited even the most roughest disciples. We want to invite you to come in honesty, not with excuses, but to be freed. And there is no blame. There's a little book called The Book of Joy, which is a book of a conversation between former Archbishop of Cape Town, Desmond Tutu, and the Dalai Lama. And it's a good little book. It's about joy. And the quote on the next slide is one of the best quotes that you might want to take a photograph and reflect on through the week. They talk about, of course, Desmond Tutu lived and worked and led the church through the time pre-apartheid of tremendous oppression and injustice. And his life was constantly in danger. And he says suffering is inevitable. But how we respond to that suffering is our choice. Not even oppression or occupation can take away this freedom to choose our response. And then they talk and unpack in the book the 8 pillars of joy. And they divide them into 2 fours. The first is the 4 qualities of the mind. Perspective, to see the good alongside the bad. It isn't totally without hope, but to see the good things, the trees, the football, the drink, the food. Perspective, humility, to come in honesty before God and say sorry. Humor, to be able to laugh. And acceptance, to be able to say, this is the reality. I'm not pretending it's not happening. I'm facing it. I don't like it, but I'm not denying it. So those are the 4 qualities of the mind. And then they talk about the 4 qualities of the heart. Forgiveness, to let go of all the blame of ourselves or of others, just to give it to Jesus. To then live in gratitude, to live in compassion and generosity for others. That is a great recipe for joy. Somebody said to me this morning, they reminded me of the J-O-Y. Well, apparently that spells joy. Jesus, others, you. You get things in perspective. And they celebrated, and there was great joy. And this is our resurrection day. How can joy help us? Because gratitude lifts despair. If we can see in the midst of difficulty something good, that is a taste, a whisper, a glimpse, a signpost to what is to come, and reveals the goodness of God. How can joy help us? Because hope, looking forward, seeing what is to come, what will be, it gives us resilience to cope with. So for the joy set before us, because this isn't everything, because these 40 seconds will be up, we keep going. And because forgiveness brings peace.